Well now, look who wandered in just before dream time. Welcome, my dear traveler, to the Academy of Sleep. I'm Grandpa Ryan, your humble guide through old stories, quiet wonders, and the kind of history they don't rush to tell you in school. The kind that drifts like sea foam and lingers like a bedtime breeze. Now, before your eyelids start doing that little sleepy dance, why not tap that subscribe button? Go on, do it now. You'll thank yourself in the morning. And then, we'll begin. The Age of Discovery, How the World Was Redrawn. Chapter 1. Prologue. A world yet unseen. Before the sails were raised and the compasses spun, before the names of continents became familiar and maps took their modern shape, there was a time when the edges of the world were blurred by clouds of myth and wonder. The known world in the early 15th century was, in many ways, a patchwork of assumptions stitched together with hearsay and belief. For centuries, European minds gazed at the edges of parchment maps, where dragons roamed and the oceans fell into nothingness. Much of the globe was veiled in mystery. To the north lay frozen lands few dared to name. To the south, a rumored continent called Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, was whispered of, but never seen. To the west stretched the endless sea, and to the east, riches from the Orient, arrived only through long, perilous trade routes, or the stories of returning merchants. Most people in medieval Europe lived and died without ever leaving the village where they were born. The idea of crossing vast oceans into the unknown was not only terrifying, but practically impossible. Until slowly, the conditions began to shift. The Renaissance, that great awakening of curiosity and reason, had begun to ripple through the courts and cities of Europe. Monarchs, inspired by tales of ancient glory and driven by ambition, began to sponsor expeditions to seek wealth and knowledge beyond the limits of the known. New inventions such as the astrolabe, the mariner's compass, and improved ship designs like the caravel began to make longer voyages feasible. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire's growing power in the east disrupted the overland trade routes to Asia, forcing European powers to seek alternatives by sea. And thus, in ports like Lisbon, Seville, and Venice, dreams began to form. Dreams of reaching the Indies by sailing westward, of discovering golden cities, of carving new paths across the oceans. It was an age when the earth itself seemed to invite daring souls to rewrite its story. The Age of Discovery was not born in a single moment, but emerged gradually, as shifting tides of curiosity, necessity, and ambition carried mankind further into the unknown. It was not only an age of sails and spices, but of questions. What lies beyond the horizon? Can the world be circled? How far can a man go before he returns to where he began? This prologue is not merely a preface to a historical tale. It is a quiet invitation to lie back, close your eyes, and drift into a time when oceans were mysteries, the stars were maps, and the world was a riddle waiting to be revealed. Chapter 2. The Call of the Sea. What sparked the age of exploration? The sea has always whispered to those who listened, a whisper of freedom, of danger, of worlds not yet seen. But in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, that whisper began to rise into a collective call, heard not just by sailors and wanderers, but by kings and scholars, merchants and monks. It was the call of the sea that began to tug at the fabric of the medieval world, unraveling centuries of isolation and reshaping the destiny of nations. For some, it was gold that beckoned. Tales from the East told of unimaginable riches, spices that preserved meat and transformed bland meals into feasts, silks that shimmered like water, gems that glinted with fire. These treasures had flowed into Europe through complex land routes for centuries, passing from caravan to caravan along the Silk Road. But that road was long and dangerous, and as the Ottoman Empire expanded, many of its vital arteries were blocked or taxed beyond profitability. A new route was needed, one that bypassed the bottlenecks of Asia and delivered the goods of the Orient directly into the hands of European merchants. For others, it was faith that guided the rudder. The spread of Christianity was not only a spiritual mission, but a justification for conquest. Popes and princes alike dreamed of converting distant lands, bringing the gospel to what they called the heathen nations, and finding the legendary Christian king Prester John, whose mythical kingdom was believed to lie somewhere in the east. In this vision, exploration was sanctified. Every voyage became not just a commercial venture, but a divine task. For monarchs and statesmen, the call was one of power. The world was changing, slowly, then all at once. New weapons were appearing, new technologies, old feudal systems were weakening, and nation-states were rising. To control trade was to control wealth, and to control wealth was to control destiny. The sea offered the promise of empire, of overseas possessions, tribute, resources, and eternal glory. Portugal and Spain, locked in a rivalry for dominance of the Atlantic, led the charge. Later came England, France, and the Netherlands. But none would have moved so boldly were it not for the quiet revolutions unfolding in their harbors and universities. Advances in navigation, shipbuilding, and astronomy transformed the art of sailing from a gamble into a science. The mariner's compass, imported from China, allowed ships to hold their course even when stars were hidden. The astrolabe, refined in the Muslim world, gave sailors the ability to determine their latitude using the sun or stars. Portolan charts, once crude and regional, became increasingly accurate as voyages returned with new data. And then, there were the ships themselves. The development of the caravel, a small, agile vessel with lateen sails, gave navigators the ability to tack against the wind, to explore coastlines with ease, and to undertake longer voyages than ever before. These were the engines of the age, compact, reliable, and filled with promise. Yet beyond all technical and political motives, there was something deeper that stirred in the hearts of men. A restless curiosity, a yearning to know, to break the boundaries of the familiar and test the limits of the possible. In dusty libraries and candlelit monasteries, ancient texts were rediscovered, the works of Ptolemy, Herodotus, and Pliny the Elder. From these pages came hints of forgotten lands and misplaced islands, of antipodes and great rivers, of circumnavigable oceans and distant civilizations. Imagination fused with ambition, myth tangled with mathematics, and the sea, always present but never fully understood, became a road without walls or borders, stretching into mystery. The age of exploration did not rise from one reason alone, but from a convergence. Commerce, religion, science, politics, and wonder all reached their boiling point in the same era. The world was ready to be found, and Europe was ready to look. But even as the caravels were launched and the charts were drawn, No one could have foreseen how profoundly the course of human history was about to shift. What began as a quest for spices would become a global transformation. The call of the sea was not just an invitation to sail. It was a summons to change the world. Chapter 3. Maps of Imagination. How the world was once drawn. Long before satellites traced the blue curves of continents and digital maps charted every alley and shoreline, the image of the world lived in the minds of men, half memory, half myth. To map the earth was not merely a task of geography, but of imagination. In the Middle Ages, maps were often spiritual more than spatial, shaped not by compass points or coastlines, but by theology, legend, and fragmented hearsay from travelers who claimed to have glimpsed the edge of the world. At the center of many medieval maps lay Jerusalem, the heart of Christian cosmology, with the three known continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa radiating outward in rough symmetry. These were not maps for navigation, but for meditation, echoing the sacred symmetry of divine design. The TO map, a common medieval form, showed the world divided by a T into three parts, surrounded by the O of the encircling ocean. It was simple, symbolic, and utterly disconnected from the physical geography of the world. And yet it was a beginning, a first attempt to hold the vastness of Earth within the confines of parchment and ink. But for all their limitations, these maps told stories. Margins were filled with warnings and wonders. "Here be dragons," some declared, a phrase never actually written in Latin, but whose spirit haunted every edge. There were monstrous races said to dwell in far lands, dog-headed men, people with faces on their chests, and others who walked backward with their feet facing the wrong way. There were islands that appeared only to vanish, and seas that boiled with perpetual storms. The more distant a place was from Europe, the more fantastical its description became. Yet amid the fables, there were hints of reality, just enough truth to make the maps dangerous. The accounts of travelers like Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, though colored by awe and hearsay, brought fragments of distant empires into focus. Descriptions of Chinese dynasties, Indian spices, and African gold mines crept into the imaginations of scholars and sailors alike. A new hunger began to stir, the desire not just to believe in these lands, but to find them. As printing presses spread and Renaissance curiosity bloomed, cartography began to evolve. The rediscovery of Ptolemy's Geographia in the 15th century revolutionized European mapmaking. His method of using coordinates to plot locations was centuries ahead of its time, and once it was translated and printed, it spread rapidly across the continent. Maps became more than metaphors. They became tools, still imperfect, still speculative, but increasingly ambitious. Each voyage added new lines. Each return brought back details. A bay here, an island there, the shape of a coastline scribbled hastily in a captain's log or carved into memory. Explorers did not just sail into the unknown. They brought it home, reconfiguring the known world with every crossing. But even then, maps were never purely practical. They bore the fingerprints of their makers, the biases of their patrons, the pride of their kingdoms, and the dreams of their times. Portuguese maps were closely guarded state secrets, as valuable as gold. Spanish charts of the Americas often exaggerated certain territories, projecting power through ink and paper. Dutch mapmakers, whose skill became legendary, filled their works with intricate details and ornate flourishes, not only for accuracy, but for prestige. And as the known world expanded, so too did the scale and ambition of the maps themselves. Atlases were compiled, globes were crafted, and ceiling frescoes in royal chambers began to depict entire hemispheres. One of the most striking examples of the evolving worldview was the 1507 Waldseemüller map, the first to name the newly discovered continent America after Amerigo Vespucci. In that moment, the world was not only redrawn, it was renamed. For those who viewed these maps, the emotional impact was profound. The Earth was no longer a static creation, but a dynamic, living mystery. There were lands waiting to be claimed, people waiting to be converted or conquered, riches waiting to be extracted. Maps were not just records of where humanity had been. They were manifestos of where it believed it could go. They were promises, fantasies, and blueprints for empires. Even today, the legacy of those early maps lingers. Though satellite images have rendered the globe measurable and precise, something ineffable remains in the inked coastlines of those ancient charts. A spirit of wonder, a yearning to explore, a belief that the edge of the known is always just one voyage away. And so we look back not only to see what was believed, but to feel what it meant to live in a time when the world was still unknown. And the act of drawing it was the first step toward changing it. Chapter 4. Prince Henry the Navigator and the Portuguese Dawn. At the far edge of Europe, where the continent meets the Atlantic in rugged cliffs and windswept shores, a quiet revolution began. Not with battles or proclamations, but with ships, charts, and a vision. It was in Portugal, a small kingdom with limited land but limitless horizon, that the age of discovery truly found its earliest champion. His name was Prince Henry of Portugal, known to history as Henry the Navigator, though he never personally captained a vessel or crossed an ocean. Still, few figures have done more to change the map of the world without ever leaving their own shores. Born in 1394, Prince Henry was the third son of King João I of Portugal. With little chance of inheriting the crown, he was granted a different sort of power, the freedom to dream beyond borders. In his youth, Henry fought in the conquest of Ceuta in North Africa, a strategic city that offered Portugal a foothold in the Muslim-controlled trade networks of the Mediterranean. It was there that he first glimpsed the wealth and mystery of the lands beyond the Sahara. Gold, spices, slaves, ivory. These were goods not made in Ceuta, but traded through it, arriving from deeper, unknown realms to the south. Henry's imagination caught fire. What if Portugal could reach the source of this wealth? What if there were lands beyond the desert and seas beyond the known edge of the map? What if one could reach India, not by crossing hostile Muslim territories, but by sailing round Africa? And so began one of the most ambitious and long-term projects of exploration the world had ever seen. On the southwestern tip of Portugal, in the lonely cliffs of Sagres, Henry established a center of maritime innovation, unlike any other. Though often mythologized as a school of navigation, what he truly built was a hub, a gathering place for mapmakers, astronomers, shipbuilders, and seasoned sailors. Here, knowledge flowed like tides. Techniques from the Islamic world, such as the use of the astrolabe and improved cartography, were studied and adapted. Ideas from classical texts mingled with first-hand reports from fishermen and traders. Henry's initiative wasn't driven by curiosity alone. It was also a calculated effort to break the stranglehold of Venetian and Ottoman merchants who dominated the trade of Eastern goods. By finding a sea route to West Africa and eventually India, Portugal could bypass the intermediaries and take control of the trade routes themselves. It was a vision of both economic independence and imperial ambition. Under Henry's patronage, Portuguese ships began to push southward along the African coast, slowly, cautiously, often painfully. Each voyage moved the line of the known world a little further. In 1434, Gil Yanes, one of Henry's captains, finally rounded Cape Boyador, a feared promontory in western Sahara that had long been considered impassable. This single achievement broke a psychological barrier, dispelling centuries of fear about the treacherous southern seas. After that, progress accelerated. Portuguese sailors reached the Canary Islands, the Madeira archipelago, and the Azores. They traded along the coast of Mauritania and Senegal, bringing back gold dust, exotic animals, and enslaved peoples. The beginnings of what would later become the transatlantic slave trade. While Henry did not live to see the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope or the opening of the sea route to India, he laid the groundwork for all that followed. His methods were meticulous. Every returning ship was required to share its findings. New charts were drawn. Currents were noted. Stars were recorded. A vast body of practical maritime knowledge was amassed and guarded, forming the navigational arsenal that would power Portugal's expansion for decades. Henry died in 1460, before the greatest voyages of the Portuguese Empire took place. But his legacy would echo across oceans. Within a few decades, Bartolomeu Dias would round the southern tip of Africa, and Vasco da Gama would reach India, completing the dream that Henry had nurtured in Sagres. In time, Portugal would establish a sprawling maritime empire, stretching from Brazil to Goa to Macau. All of it began with a prince who never sailed, but who understood that the world was bigger than it seemed, and who dared to reach for its edges. In a time when most men feared the sea, Henry listened to its call. He turned Portugal toward the horizon and lit the lantern that would guide others through uncharted waters. The Portuguese dawn was not marked by a single sunrise, but by a steady brightening of the world. One wave, 1 mile, one ship at a time. Chapter 5. Vasco da Gama. The Sea Road to India. By the final decades of the 15th century, the Kingdom of Portugal had become something it had never been before, a gateway to the unknown. With each expedition, its maps stretched southward along the spine of Africa, hugging the coasts, charting new capes, and naming strange lands. But one destination remained as elusive as ever: India. For centuries, it had been the source of riches beyond imagining. Black pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, nutmeg, silk, and jewels, commodities so valuable that they were weighed like gold. Yet, to European powers, the route to India remained a costly riddle, dominated by overland trade networks controlled by Arab and Venetian intermediaries. What if the sea, vast and treacherous, could bypass it all? What if a ship could reach the fabled Indian ports by rounding Africa and following the winds east? The dream was not new, but now, for the first time, it seemed within reach. And in 1497, the man chosen to attempt this final leap into the unknown was Vasco da Gama, a nobleman, a seasoned mariner, and soon, a name that would echo across history. Little is known of Vasco da Gama's early life. He was born around 1460 in the coastal town of Sines, into a family with a strong maritime tradition. By the time he took command of his historic voyage, he was in his late 30s, battle-hardened and clear-eyed. He was not a romantic idealist, nor a poetic dreamer of distant lands. He was a pragmatist, calm, resolute, and known for his cold efficiency. He did not need to imagine what lay beyond the horizon. He only needed to find it. On the 8th of July, 1497, da Gama departed Lisbon with 4 ships and fewer than 200 men. The fleet was modest, but its mission was vast: to find a maritime route to India by circling the entire southern half of Africa and crossing the Indian Ocean, something no European had done before. The ships passed familiar ports, then entered less-known waters. They rounded the Cape Verde Islands and sailed south toward the equator. For weeks they battled unpredictable winds and monstrous swells. They were forced to stop along the West African coast to make repairs and gather food. Disease and fatigue set in, but da Gama pressed on. In November, the fleet reached the Cape of Good Hope, a turning point both literal and symbolic. First rounded by Bartolomeo Diaz, a decade earlier, it marked the beginning of the unknown. From here, da Gama was no longer simply extending old routes. He was sailing into a blank space on the map. The crew passed through waters few Europeans had ever dared to cross. The Agulhas Current, swift and unforgiving, which tore ships from their course and hurled them toward the rocks. But da Gama held firm. After months of hardship, the fleet reached the East African coast and stopped in what is now Mozambique. There, for the first time, they encountered the Muslim traders and sailors who controlled the Indian Ocean. Da Gama, armed with poor translators and cultural ignorance, quickly clashed with the local rulers. He posed as a wealthy merchant, but lacked the goods that would impress the Arab and Swahili elites. Tensions escalated. His ships were nearly attacked. But through cunning and audacity, he escaped and continued northward. In Mombasa, he again faced hostility. In Malindi, however, he found his first ally. There, he secured the services of a skilled navigator, possibly a Gujarati Muslim, or even an experienced sailor from the Arabian Sea, who knew the monsoon winds and the eastward route. With this critical knowledge, da Gama turned out into the open ocean. In May 1498, after nearly 10 months at sea, the fleet finally arrived at Calicut, on the southwestern coast of India. It was a moment of triumph, unlike any Portugal had known. But triumph did not mean welcome. Calicut, a bustling hub of commerce, was ruled by the Zamorin, a powerful monarch with established ties to Arab traders who viewed the Portuguese with suspicion. Da Gama brought gifts, but they were considered laughably unimpressive. His offers of alliance were met with politeness, then resistance. He was watched, restricted, and eventually forced to leave under growing tension. Still, he had accomplished what no one before him had. He had found a sea route to India. The return journey was even more brutal than the outbound voyage. Scurvy ravaged the crew. Over half of the sailors died before reaching Portugal again. Yet when da Gama sailed back into Lisbon in the summer of 1499, he was hailed as a hero, the man who had opened the door to the East. The consequences were immediate and profound. Trade with India, once filtered through a dozen hands and cities, could now be conducted by sea. Spices flooded into Europe. Fortresses were established. Fleets followed. And soon, Portuguese garrisons would line the coasts of Africa, the Middle East, and India. Da Gama's voyage signaled the rise of a global network, not just of commerce, but of conquest. He returned to India twice more, the final time as the Portuguese viceroy, tasked with enforcing military control. His methods were ruthless, his diplomacy sharp as steel. He bombarded cities, hanged hostages, and imposed naval blockades. To many, he was a symbol of European ambition in its rawest form. Brilliant in vision, brutal in execution. Yet his place in history remains fixed. Vasco da Gama did not merely find a route to India. He cracked the world open. He proved that oceans could connect rather than divide, that the globe could be navigated like a puzzle, one piece at a time. He sailed not toward myth, but toward reality, and by doing so, turned the dreams of princes into the foundations of empire. Chapter 6, 1492, Columbus sails west. There are dates in history that seem to echo beyond the pages of any book, dates that divide the world into before and after. One such date is 1492. It marks a voyage that would alter the fate of continents, topple civilizations, redraw the lines of maps, and set into motion one of the most sweeping transformations in human history. In that year, a man named Cristoforo Colombo, known to the Spanish as Cristobal Colon, and to much of the world today as Christopher Columbus, set sail westward from the shores of Spain with 3 ships and a radical belief that by heading into the unknown expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, he could reach the rich lands of the East. Columbus was not a prince or a nobleman. He was born in Genoa, a seafaring city on the coast of modern Italy, likely in the year 1451. From a young age, he was drawn to ships, charts, and the scent of salt air. He studied navigation, read ancient texts, and developed an unshakable belief that the world was round, and that the riches of Asia could be reached more directly by sailing west, instead of following the long, costly routes around Africa or across the Silk Road. It was not a new idea, but it was one most scholars considered flawed. Columbus underestimated the true size of the earth and overestimated the width of Asia. He believed the journey west to Chipangu, Japan, would be short, perhaps a few weeks. In reality, between Europe and Asia lay an entire ocean and a continent unknown to his world. For years, Columbus sought a patron to fund his expedition. He was dismissed in Portugal, laughed out of Genoa, and ignored in Venice. But in Spain, he found ears willing to listen. King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile, newly united in marriage and flush with triumph, after completing the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, were eager to elevate their realm to global power. They saw promise in Columbus's audacity, and more importantly, they saw potential in the trade, tribute, and territory his voyage might bring. In 1492, the same year they took Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, they agreed to fund his voyage. 3 ships were prepared: the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. They were not mighty galleons, but modest caravels, sturdy and swift. With a crew of about 90 men, Columbus set sail from Palos de la Frontera on the 3rd of August. He stopped briefly in the Canary Islands to resupply and adjust rigging. Then, On the 6th of September, he departed westward, into waters no European had charted, toward a horizon that seemed to stretch forever. The voyage was long, longer than most of the crew expected. As the weeks passed and no land appeared, murmurs of mutiny grew. Columbus kept two sets of records, one for himself and one for the crew, the latter understating the distance traveled to ease their fears. He gave speeches of confidence by day and whispered prayers by night. Then, in the early morning hours of October 12th, land was sighted. A sailor named Rodrigo de Triana, standing watch aboard the Pinta, cried out. They had reached what Columbus believed were the outer islands of the Indies. In truth, he had arrived in the Bahamas, on an island he named San Salvador. The world had just changed, though no one yet understood how completely. In the days and weeks that followed, Columbus explored several islands of the Caribbean, including Cuba and Hispaniola. He encountered the indigenous Taino people, whose generosity and curiosity astonished him. He also saw signs of gold, and with that, the expedition's tone shifted. What had begun as exploration now tilted toward conquest. Columbus returned to Spain in 1493 with captives, trinkets, and glowing tales of a new world, overflowing with wealth. He was hailed as a hero, granted titles, honors, and the promise of governorship over all lands he would discover. But the truth was far more complicated. He hadn't found Asia. He had stumbled upon a continent unknown to his sponsors, a land already home to millions whose civilizations, cultures, and lives would soon be forever disrupted. Columbus would make 3 more voyages, each marked by increasing conflict, disappointment, and cruelty. He founded a settlement on Hispaniola that collapsed into violence. He demanded tribute in gold from indigenous peoples who had none. He enslaved and executed those who resisted. By his 3rd voyage, rumors of mismanagement and brutality reached Spain. By the 4th, he was stripped of many of his titles. He died in 1506, wealthy but disillusioned, still believing he had reached the outskirts of Asia. He never knew the full scale of his impact. And yet, his voyage became a turning point in world history. It triggered what is now known as the Columbian Exchange, the massive transfer of plants, animals, peoples, cultures, diseases, and ideas between the old and new worlds. Crops like potatoes, tomatoes, maize, and cacao changed European diets forever. Horses and cattle were introduced to the Americas. Epidemics like smallpox, carried unknowingly by Europeans, devastated indigenous populations on a catastrophic scale. The balance of the world tilted. Empires rose, others fell. The map, once hemmed in by the limits of knowledge, began to stretch across oceans. Columbus was not the first to cross the Atlantic. Norse sailors had done so centuries earlier. But his voyage was the spark that lit the fuse of global transformation. Even now, Columbus remains a figure of fierce debate. To some, he is a symbol of courage, ambition, and discovery. To others, he is a harbinger of conquest, genocide, and exploitation. Perhaps he was both. A man of his time, driven by flawed maps and fervent dreams, who set out in search of one world and found another. A sailor whose miscalculation became one of history's greatest turning points. And so, the year 1492 became etched into memory, a date that marks not just a voyage, but a collision of worlds, a wind that blew westward and never stopped. Chapter 7. the Spanish conquest, gold, glory, and grief. In the wake of Columbus's return, a fever took hold of Spain, a fever of gold and glory, burning hotter with each rumor that crossed the Atlantic. His voyage had not led to the spice ports of Asia, but something more tantalizing, a new world, uncharted, untouched by European hands, and, it seemed, filled with peoples who bore neither steel nor gunpowder. To the monarchs of Spain, it was a divine gift. To the men who followed, it was a vast, gleaming opportunity. And so, not long after the first ships returned from the Caribbean, others set out, not in search of geography, but of conquest. What began as exploration would soon spiral into colonization, warfare, and the total reshaping of entire civilizations. At the heart of this story stood a name etched into the stone of empires and the bones of ruin: Hernán Cortés. Born in 1485 in Medellin, Spain, Cortés came from minor nobility and was driven from a young age by restlessness and ambition. He sailed to the New World as a young man and spent years in Hispaniola and Cuba, learning the politics of the colonies and gaining a reputation for cunning and audacity. In 1519, he was chosen to lead an expedition westward to the mainland, officially under the authority of the Cuban governor, though in truth, Cortés had no intention of merely exploring. He sought kingdoms to conquer. He had heard whispers from traders and shipwrecked sailors of a great empire to the west, an empire of wealth and stone cities, ruled by a mysterious sovereign. This was Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, and its name would soon echo in European courts like a myth reborn. With just over 600 men, a few cannons, and a small number of horses, creatures entirely unknown to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, Cortés landed on the coast of what is now Mexico. He burned his own ships to ensure no retreat. From there, he marched inland. The journey was more than military. It was psychological. Along the way, Cortés formed alliances with indigenous tribes who resented the dominance of the Aztecs, most notably the Tlaxcalans. These alliances, born of desperation and revenge, would prove decisive. The Spanish did not conquer alone. They arrived as the sharp edge of a fractured political world. When Cortés finally reached Tenochtitlan, he was welcomed as an honored guest by Emperor Moctezuma II. The reasons remain debated. Some sources suggest the Aztecs mistook him for the returning god Quetzalcoatl, while others argue that Moctezuma sought to avoid war and gauge the Spaniards' true strength. Either way, it was a meeting unlike any in history, a fusion of worlds separated by millennia, suddenly colliding face to face. Tenochtitlan was a marvel, a floating city of causeways and canals, markets and palaces, with pyramids that rose like stone mountains in the mist. The Spaniards were stunned. Cortés, however, saw not awe but opportunity. He took Moctezuma hostage in his own palace and tried to rule the empire through the emperor's trembling voice. Tensions rose, rebellion erupted, and blood was spilled. The Spanish were eventually forced to flee the city in a desperate retreat, known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, during which many drowned under the weight of stolen gold as they tried to escape across narrow causeways. But Cortés did not give up. He regrouped, reinforced, and laid siege to Tenochtitlan in 1521. The battle was brutal. The canals ran red. Famine, disease, and warfare tore through the once mighty city. In the end, it fell. The Aztec Empire collapsed, and a new order emerged, a Spanish colony built on the ashes of gods. The conquest of the Aztecs was not the only one. In South America, a similar fate awaited the Inca Empire. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro, a distant cousin of Cortés, captured the Incan Emperor Atahualpa during a meeting. Though a ransom of gold and silver was paid, a room filled to the ceiling, Atahualpa was executed. The Spaniards marched on Cusco and claimed another jewel of civilization. The Incas, like the Aztecs, were undone not only by weapons but by division, betrayal, and disease. Smallpox had arrived before the Spaniards in many cases, weakening populations and unraveling resistance. What followed was not peace, but transformation, violent, sweeping, irreversible. Indigenous cultures were dismantled. Temples were torn down and churches erected in their place. Gold and silver flowed from the New World into Spanish treasuries, funding palaces, wars, and dreams of empire. But the human cost was beyond calculation. Entire populations were decimated. Ancient traditions were lost. Languages disappeared. The conquest reshaped not only the Americas, but Europe itself, flooding it with wealth that would fuel further expansion, sparking inflation, economic shifts, and ideological debates over the morality of colonization. To the conquistadors, this was divine destiny. They saw themselves as instruments of God, bringers of civilization and salvation. But to the millions whose worlds were shattered, it was an apocalypse wrapped in armor. And yet, within the wreckage, new cultures began to form. Mestizo identities that combined Spanish and indigenous roots, new languages, new syncretic religions, and new stories. The conquest was not a simple erasure, but a collision, a layering of histories that continues to echo in every border, every cathedral built atop a pyramid, every surname inherited from two continents at once. The Spanish conquest was driven by greed and belief, strategy and accident. It brought forth empires, but it buried empires too. Gold and glory may have been its promise, but grief, enduring grief, was its shadow. And as the ships returned again and again to Europe, their hulls heavy with treasure, the world had been permanently split into before and after. In that silence between cannon blasts and missionary sermons, a question remained. Could the world ever be made whole again? Chapter 8. Magellan and the First Circumnavigation of the Earth. In every era, there are those who seek not only to explore the edges of maps, but to prove that the world itself can be wrapped in the wake of a single voyage. In the early 16th century, that man was Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese nobleman turned Spanish commander. Magellan would lead one of the most daring expeditions in the history of navigation, one that would stretch across 3 years, 3 oceans, and change forever how humanity understood the shape and scale of its world. Born in 1480 in northern Portugal, Magellan grew up during the golden age of maritime exploration. He studied maps and astronomy, served in Portuguese fleets in India and Malacca, and witnessed firsthand the reach and limits of his country's power. But after a dispute with the Portuguese crown, Magellan renounced his homeland and offered his vision to Spain, to reach the Spice Islands, the coveted Moluccas. By sailing west through unexplored waters around the newly discovered South American continent. It was a bold plan. While Columbus had crossed the Atlantic and stumbled into the Americas, and Vasco da Gama had sailed around Africa to India, No European had yet found a westward route to Asia through the southern seas. Many doubted it could be done. The Americas, vast and mysterious, blocked the path. But Magellan believed there was a passage, a hidden strait, that would lead from the Atlantic to the great ocean beyond. In September of 1519, Magellan departed from Seville with 5 ships and about 270 men. They sailed across the Atlantic, stopping at the coast of Brazil, and then down along the wild, wind-battered shores of South America. For months, they searched for the elusive waterway that would allow them to pass through to the other side. At last, near the southern tip of the continent, they found it, a winding, treacherous passage now known as the Strait of Magellan. For 38 days, the fleet crept through its cold, fog-choked waters, dodging rocks and currents, not knowing whether it would lead to open sea or dead end. And then it opened. Before them lay a vast ocean, so calm compared to the stormy Atlantic that Magellan named it the Mar Pacifico, the Pacific Ocean. But it was not peaceful for long. The crossing took over 3 months, and during that time, the sailors ran out of food. They ate sawdust, leather, and rats. Scurvy and starvation spread through the crew. Many died, and all suffered. Still, they pushed on. In March 1521, they reached the islands of the Philippines, where Magellan hoped to rest, resupply, and establish diplomatic ties. But fate had another plan. In an effort to support a local ruler in a tribal dispute, Magellan involved himself in a conflict on the island of Magellan. He led a small force ashore, was surrounded, and was killed in battle. He would not live to see the completion of his voyage. Command passed to Juan Sebastián Elcano, who led the last surviving ship, the Victoria, westward, across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and back to Spain. When the Victoria limped into port in September 1522, nearly 3 years had passed. Only 18 men remained. But they had done what no one else in history had achieved. They had sailed all the way around the globe. They had proved beyond theory and speculation that the earth was round and could be circumnavigated. They had mapped new coasts, encountered new peoples, crossed oceans that once seemed impossible. Magellan did not live to complete his own circle, but the voyage he began marked a turning point in human consciousness. The world, once infinite in imagination, had boundaries now. It had a shape, a scope. The unknown had been pierced, and though much mystery remained, a thread had been drawn through continents and currents, tying the globe together in a single fragile line of sailcloth and courage. Chapter 9. Conquistadors and Corsairs, Pirates of the Empire. In the wake of discovery came desire, raw, unrelenting, and hungry for more. Gold glittered not only in rivers and temples, but in the imaginations of every sailor who had tasted salt on his lips and heard tales of cities paved with riches. And so, the age of explorers gave way to the age of takers. The conquistadors and corsairs stepped onto the stage, not with wonder in their eyes, but with steel in their hands. The conquistadors, conquerors as their name declares, were not content to chart coastlines or make treaties. They came to seize. Men like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro carved empires from civilizations that had stood for centuries, often with fewer than 1,000 men. They wielded gunpowder, horses, and alliances with indigenous enemies of the empires they sought to dismantle. But they also wielded something more terrifying, the unshakable belief that God had given them dominion. Their banners bore crosses, their swords bore royal crests, and their appetites bore no limit. Yet they were not alone. Just as Spain and Portugal carved up new worlds, other nations watched with envy. England, France, and the Netherlands, denied by treaty or fortune, turned to the seas with a different strategy. If they couldn't claim land, they would intercept wealth. Thus emerged the corsairs and privateers, pirates in all but name, sanctioned by crowns to raid and plunder the Spanish Main, the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, the trade routes of the Atlantic, all became hunting grounds. These corsairs were hybrids of explorer and outlaw. They sailed under letters of marque, documents that blurred legality and crime, granting them the authority to attack enemy ships during wartime. In practice, many ignored the enemy part entirely. Men like Francis Drake, a hero to the English and a scourge to the Spanish, circled the globe, leaving fire and fear in his wake. Others operated from island hideouts, striking swiftly, vanishing with gold, silver, and spices, the lifeblood of empire. The lines between conquistador and corsair often blurred. Both operated at the edge of the world, far from royal courts and slow justice. Both shaped history through audacity, violence, and ambition. And both left legacies stained in blood and glory. Some were hailed as national heroes, others hanged from gallows, but all of them, sanctioned or rogue, cloaked in scripture or shadow, were children of the same fever, the lust for the new world and everything it promised. It is tempting to romanticize these men, to paint them as bold adventurers dancing along the edge of empire. But beneath the plumes and polished armor lay a colder truth. They were architects of plunder, agents of upheaval. They opened the world, but they opened wounds as well. Chapter 10. Caravels and cannons, technology of the high seas. Behind every great voyage lies not just courage or command, but craft, the silent machinery that carries dreams across oceans. The age of discovery was not only a triumph of will, but of wood, wind, and iron. For without the tools to brave the vast and shifting sea, ambition alone would have foundered on the rocks. The empires of Europe expanded not just on maps, but on the hulls of their ships, and the ships themselves told a story of innovation, adaptation, and calculated risk. Foremost among these was the caravel. Unlike the heavy, cumbersome vessels of the earlier medieval period, the caravel was a revelation in design. Small, light, and fast, with triangular lateen sails that allowed it to tack against the wind. It could hug coastlines with agility, slip into unknown harbors, and brave narrow rivers, ideal for exploration. The Portuguese were the first to perfect it, sending it down the West African coast and later across the wide Atlantic. When combined with square sails, the result was the Nao, a ship like Columbus's Santa Maria, capable of oceanic voyages, yet still maneuverable enough for uncertain waters. Then came the galleon, a floating fortress born from the marriage of trade and warfare. Larger and sturdier than the caravel, galleons were the workhorses of empire, transporting silver from the Americas, spices from the East, and soldiers to distant outposts. With high sterns and layered decks, they bristled with cannons and commanded respect on the high seas. Where a caravel had opened the door, the galleon made sure it stayed open, and under the crown's control. But it wasn't just about the ships. It was about what they carried, and not in their holds, but on their decks. Cannons turned fragile wooden hulls into mobile weapons. Compass needles, once seen as magic, became trusted guides. The astrolabe inherited and refined from Arabic science allowed sailors to measure latitude by the stars. Cross staffs and later quadrants improved accuracy. Hourglasses tracked time. Logs dragged behind the ship estimated speed. With each tool, the sea became less unknowable, still wild, but increasingly chartable. Navigation was both science and superstition. Mariners whispered prayers to St. Elmo, watched for omens in the clouds, and feared the sudden calm of the doldrums as much as any storm. Maps were improving, but still filled with errors, blank spaces, and hopeful guesses. Yet these instruments, however primitive by today's standards, marked a turning point in human mobility. They allowed not just movement, but memory, a way to return, report, and record. Technology did more than fuel expansion. It reshaped the very idea of what was possible. A century earlier, to imagine crossing an ocean would have sounded like madness. Now, with the right ship and the right wind, it became a strategy, a campaign, a destiny. And so, the age of discovery was propelled not only by those who dreamed of new worlds, but by those who built the vessels that made dreaming tangible, and those who dared to trust wood and canvas against the roar of the deep. Chapter 11. Trade Winds and Treasures, the Global Spice Race. Before oil, before gold, before sugar and silver, there were spices: cloves, nutmeg, pepper, cinnamon, small things, fragrant and dry, light enough to carry in a pouch, yet heavy with value beyond their weight. To the medieval and Renaissance world, these were more than ingredients. They were medicine, status, seduction. A pinch of clove could perfume a noble feast. A handful of peppercorns could pay a servant's wage. And so it was that entire fleets were launched, wars waged, and continents crossed, all for the pursuit of flavor. The great spice race did not begin with desire alone, but with dependency. In Europe's cold climate, spices preserved meat, masked spoilage, and elevated humble dishes into signs of refinement. But these precious goods came from distant lands: India, Ceylon, the Moluccas, the so-called Spice Islands, whose names alone shimmered with mystery. For centuries, spices traveled a long, winding path across Asia, through Persian markets and Ottoman territories, eventually reaching Venetian merchants who sold them at enormous profit. Portugal's dream of a sea route to India was born from this imbalance, a desire to bypass the long chain of middlemen and reach the source. Vasco da Gama's voyage cracked that chain wide open. Soon, Portuguese ships were docking in Calicut, Goa, and Malacca, carrying not only cargo, but cannon. Trading posts became fortresses, alliances became occupations, and profit became empire. Spain, not to be outdone, sent ships westward, hoping to reach the same treasures by another path. Though they stumbled upon the Americas instead, the search continued. Magellan's fateful circumnavigation ended in the Philippines, tantalizingly close to the Moluccas. The Dutch followed, ousting the Portuguese from many of their eastern holdings and establishing the Dutch East India Company, a merchant force so powerful it wielded armies, negotiated treaties, and governed territories. But as the spices moved, so too did the winds. Trade winds became lifelines, guiding ships across vast stretches of sea. Mariners timed their departures with the rhythm of the monsoon, learning to read the breath of the ocean as carefully as the stars. These invisible currents, steady, predictable, generous to those who understood them, formed the arteries of a new global network. Ports grew into cities. Harbors became crossroads. The world was being stitched together, one voyage at a time. And all the while, spices continued to trickle into European kitchens and courtrooms, quiet reminders of the journeys that had shaped history. Wars may have been fought with steel and fire, but the prize was often a sack of cinnamon, a chest of cloves, or the sharp bite of pepper on the tongue. In the end, the spice race was not only about trade, but transformation. A quest for flavor became a catalyst for empire. The scent of nutmeg changed maps. The heat of pepper redefined diplomacy. And the wind, eternal and unseen, carried the ships of men who believed they were chasing taste, but who were, in truth, chasing the world. Chapter 12. The Panama Crossroad. A shortcut for empires. There is a place where the land narrows so thinly that the oceans almost touch. A slender waste of the Americas, where the Pacific and Atlantic are divided by little more than a ridge of green hills, steaming rivers, and tangled jungle. That place is Panama. And though its isthmus stretches only a few dozen miles across, it became one of the most strategic crossroads in the world, the hinge upon which empires turned. For the Spanish in the 16th century, Panama was not simply a strip of land. It was a portal, a shortcut between the wealth of the Pacific and the ports of Europe. When the conquistadors stumbled upon the riches of the Inca Empire, they realized that transporting gold and silver up the long, rugged western coast of South America and around Cape Horn was a journey of peril and time. But Panama offered a tantalizing alternative, a land bridge. Ships could unload their treasures on one side. The cargo could be carried across the isthmus, on muleback or by foot, and reloaded on vessels waiting in the opposite sea. The Spanish established the city of Nombre de Dios on the Atlantic coast and Panama City on the Pacific, linked by the Camino Real, the Royal Road. Along this route, gold flowed like a river of light, through the jungle, guarded by soldiers, sought by bandits, and watched by eyes both imperial and envious. The road was paved with ambition and greed. It was narrow, winding, and often treacherous, but it saved months of dangerous sailing. In an age where time equaled survival and treasure equaled power, Panama was a prize. But such a shortcut did not remain secret for long. Pirates and privateers, always hunting the arteries of Spanish wealth, soon turned their gaze to this narrow land. Men like Francis Drake raided the ports. Others followed the scent of bullion into the hills, ambushing mule trains and plundering caravans. For every empire that tried to claim the isthmus, there was a rival lurking offshore. Yet despite the chaos, Panama endured. It became a place of passage, not just for silver and silk, but for ideas, rumors, and disease. It connected the Atlantic world of Europe and Africa with the Pacific sphere of Asia and the Americas. It was a bottleneck and a bridge, a corridor where the world grew tighter and the maps grew bolder. Centuries later, a canal would be carved through its spine, a scar of steel and engineering. But even in the earliest days of empire, Panama was already the world's shortcut, a whisper of globalization before the word existed. Empires do not always expand outward. Sometimes they fold the world inward, bending space and time to suit their hunger. And Panama, that thin green thread, became the needle point. Chapter 13. Eastward Dreams, Encounters with China and Japan. Long before Europeans ever set sail, the East had already built empires of elegance, order, and immense sophistication. While the West dreamed of golden kingdoms and lost isles, dynasties rose and fell in China with quiet power, and Japan honed its own path with fierce independence and deep tradition. To the hungry eyes of European monarchs and merchants, the East shimmered like a mirage, distant, refined, and unimaginably wealthy. It was not simply a destination, but a dream. By the 16th century, that dream was taking shape. The Portuguese, ever the pioneers, were the first to reach China by sea, arriving in Canton in 1514. By 1557, they secured a foothold in Macau, a rocky peninsula leased from the Ming dynasty, where East met West in a strange, delicate dance of trade and suspicion. The Chinese were cautious, their empire vast and confident, with little interest in foreign goods or foreign gods. And yet they saw some value in these strange bearded traders whose cannons could be as persuasive as their silver. The Portuguese brought Jesuit missionaries who sought to convert, but also to understand. Figures like Matteo Ricci arrived not as conquerors, but as scholars, donning robes, learning Mandarin, and translating the works of Euclid and Ptolemy into Chinese. Ricci impressed the Ming court with his knowledge of astronomy and mathematics, and for a time, it seemed a new bridge might be built, not of conquest, but of intellect. Meanwhile, Japan was a different challenge, isolated by geography and bound by a feudal code. It remained largely unknown to Europe until the Portuguese arrived in 1543, shipwrecked on the shores of Tanegashima. What followed was a strange and volatile exchange. The Japanese were intrigued by European firearms, matchlocks that would change the face of samurai warfare. In return, the Portuguese gained limited access to ports like Nagasaki, trading silver, silk, and Catholicism. Jesuits entered Japan as well, and for a time, conversions surged. Daimyo warlords saw advantage in foreign alliances, even as they warred among themselves. But Japan's curiosity turned to caution. By the early 17th century, Tokugawa Ieyasu had unified the country under a strict shogunate. Foreign influence was seen as a threat to order. Christianity was outlawed, foreigners were expelled, and Japan, with careful precision, closed its doors for over 2 centuries. A silence settled over the archipelago, not of ignorance, but of sovereignty. To the Europeans, these encounters were puzzling. Here were lands they could not easily conquer, cultures they could not fully bend. China and Japan remained proud, complex, and often indifferent to European ambition. They offered porcelain, silk, lacquerware, and tea, and demanded silver, deference, and patience in return. Still, even in rejection, the dream endured. The East remained an object of fascination, a mirror reflecting not what Europe was, but what it longed to be, vast, ancient, and self-assured. The encounters were brief, sometimes cordial, sometimes tense, always shaped by imbalance and misunderstanding. But they left behind echoes, fragments of language, traces of art, and stories of strange lands where emperors ruled by heaven's mandate, and cherry blossoms fell like snow in the wind. Chapter 14. Russia's Eastward Expansion, the Siberian Tide. While Spain, Portugal, and their rivals carved new empires across the oceans, a quieter tide was rising in the vastness of the north. It did not travel by caravel or cross tropical seas. It moved on horseback, on sleds, on foot, through forests, across frozen rivers, and into the silence of the snow. This was Russia's age of discovery, and its ocean was Siberia. Unlike the maritime powers who raced towards spice and silver, Russia's eastward push was not driven by dreams of tropical riches. It was driven by furs. In the early modern world, fur was gold, especially sable, soft and dark, worn by nobles from Moscow to Paris. The forests beyond the Ural Mountains promised abundance, and so the Tsars sent men to find it. The first were the Cossacks, fierce, semi-nomadic warriors from the steppes, as comfortable in battle as in exploration. In 1581, Yermak Timofeyevich led a campaign against the Khanate of Sibir, a fading Tatar state just east of the Urals. With a small band of men and borrowed firearms, Yermak defeated the Khan's forces and claimed the gateway to a continent. His conquest opened the floodgates. What followed was not a single grand voyage, but a centuries-long migration, a slow, relentless tide of forts, outposts, and trading posts, inching ever eastward. The terrain was harsh and endless. Vast taiga forests, icy rivers, swamps, and mountains stretched for thousands of kilometers. Winters were brutal. Summers brought floods and swarms of insects. And yet the Russians advanced, driven by fur, taxes, and imperial vision. They crossed one river after another, the Ob, the Yenisei, the Lena, until in 1639, they reached the Pacific Ocean. In just over 50 years, they had traversed a continent. Unlike the maritime explorers who arrived in bursts of sails and thunder, the Siberian explorers moved like snow, steady, silent, and unstoppable. They met dozens of indigenous peoples, the Evenks, the Yakuts, the Chukchi, each with their own languages and lifeways. Some traded willingly, others resisted and were subdued. Orthodox priests followed soldiers. Taxes were demanded in furs, and slowly the frontier transformed into territory. By the 18th century, Russia had become a transcontinental empire. From the Baltic to the Pacific, it spanned 11 time zones. And though it never built a fleet to rival Spain or colonized lands across the sea, it had accomplished something equally staggering. It had redrawn the interior of Eurasia. Siberia did not glitter like gold or perfume the air like cloves, but it offered something else: vastness, remoteness, and raw power. It became a place of exile, of mystery, of quiet conquest. And in the frozen breath of its forests, a different kind of empire took root. One built not on oceans, but on endurance. Chapter 15. Cartographers and Cosmographers, Drawing the Dream. Long before the sails were raised and the ships pulled away from shore, someone had to imagine where they might go. Someone had to take a blank sheet of parchment and begin to draw, not just coastlines and rivers, but dreams. These were the cartographers, the cosmographers, the quiet minds behind the age of discovery, men of ink-stained hands and far-reaching thought, who shaped the very world the explorers set out to find. Their maps were not just instruments of travel. They were visions, each line a guess, each compass rose a prayer. At a time when much of the earth was still unknown, mapmakers blended fact with hearsay, ancient texts with sailors' tales, and geometry with imagination. They filled the gaps not only with monsters and warnings, but with hope, with continents that might exist, islands that perhaps did, and paths no one had yet dared to take. The earliest maps of the age were more art than science. Their borders curled like scrolls. Their oceans were dotted with ships and whales, their corners adorned with angels holding the heavens aloft. And yet within their flourishes lay real information. Latitude lines drawn from the stars, coastlines revised by returning captains, currents and wind patterns passed from mariner to mariner. Each voyage updated the world a little more. Each return redrew the edge of what was known. The mapmakers were many, and few are remembered. In Portugal, they were cloistered in secrecy, their charts guarded as royal property. In Spain, they worked within the Casa de la Contratación. In Seville, compiling the Padrón Real, the master map used for navigation across the Spanish Empire. In Italy, in Flanders, in the cities of the Dutch Republic, they turned whispers from distant harbors into atlases that would sell for fortunes. And then there were the cosmographers, thinkers who tried to understand not just where the world was, but what it was. They studied the heavens, plotted eclipses, traced planetary paths, and mapped not just Earth, but its place in the great cosmic machine. Some believed the world was perfect and harmonious, built to divine proportion. Others began to suspect it was more chaotic, more complex, a mystery still unfolding. They debated longitude, devised new projections, and argued about magnetic declination. Their tools were sextants and compasses, quadrants and armillary spheres. Their legacy was accuracy and awe. But perhaps their greatest contribution was not precision, but perspective. They invited humanity to think of the Earth as something that could be seen in its entirety, charted, held, and eventually understood. To look down from the heavens, even before satellites, and imagine the world as a single turning whole. And so, behind every explorer who set sail into darkness was someone who had drawn the shape of the light. Someone who stayed behind with parchment and pen, piecing together a planet from fragments and faith. The age of discovery was written in ship logs and journals, but it was also etched into vellum, in maps that guided kings, inspired poets, and made the world visible long before it was fully known. Chapter 16. The Women of the Edge, Queens, Guides, and Ghosts. History has often told the tale of discovery, with the clatter of armor and the roar of cannon, the voices of kings and captains echoing across oceans. But just beyond the sound, in the silence between expeditions and proclamations, walked the women, not always at the helm, but always present, as patrons, as translators, as survivors and symbols. The age of discovery may have been sailed by men, but many of its currents were steered by women, whose names drift like ghosts through the footnotes of history. Some sat on thrones and shaped the tide. Queen Isabella of Castile, pious and shrewd, believed in Columbus's dream when others scoffed. It was her treasury and her crown that helped launch his ships into the unknown. She was not merely a figurehead, but a political force, holding together a kingdom newly forged from war and guiding it toward empire. Without her, 1492 might have been a footnote instead of a turning point. Others guided with words instead of crowns. On the coasts and in the forests of the New World, countless indigenous women became bridges between worlds. Among the most remembered is La Malinche, born Malincine, a Nahua woman given to Hernán Cortés as tribute. She became his interpreter, his advisor, and eventually the mother of his child. Through her, Cortés communicated with empires and negotiated both peace and conquest. Some call her a traitor, others call her a survivor. But without her, much of the Spanish conquest would have stumbled in confusion and bloodshed. Her voice shaped history, even if her own story was swallowed by it. In Japan and China, women watched the European arrival with eyes sharpened by experience. Court ladies, merchants' wives, and nuns received foreign guests with suspicion or curiosity. In Goa and Manila, Portuguese and Spanish women joined their husbands in distant colonies, bearing children, managing estates, and shaping the hybrid cultures that would rise where continents met. Some wrote letters home, describing life on the edge of empire, homesick, proud, uncertain. Their words, rare and delicate, remind us that discovery was not always triumphant. It was also lonely. Then there were the forgotten ones, the enslaved women, the passengers on crowded ships, the unnamed midwives and cooks, healers and hostages whose lives were uprooted by the voyages of men. Their stories are rarely recorded, but their footsteps are there, pressed into the sand beside conquistadors and colonists alike. They bore the children of empire. They endured it, and often, they outlived it. The age of discovery has long been painted in broad, masculine strokes, ships and steel, conquest and trade. But behind those images, quieter figures move. Women who ruled, who witnessed, who translated and transformed. Some shaped destiny from the shadows. Others stood in the light, only to be written out again. Their names are few, but their influence was vast. And in every forgotten harbor, every borderland settlement, every cross-cultural child born of two worlds colliding, their presence lingers, like a ghost at the edge of the map. Chapter 17. The World Remade, Borders, Cultures, and Consequences. When the first explorers set out, they saw only the sea, endless, uncertain, full of risk and promise. They could not know that they were not merely discovering new lands, but rewriting the very shape of the world. By the end of the 17th century, the age of discovery had run its course, and in its wake lay a world unrecognizable from the one that had stood just 200 years before. The great voyages had stitched the continents together. Oceans were no longer walls, but roads. The Atlantic surged with ships carrying silver from Peru, sugar from Brazil, and slaves from Africa. The Indian Ocean, once dominated by Arab and Asian powers, became a chessboard of European ambition. The Pacific, vast and silent for millennia, was now dotted with sails. The entire globe had been charted, measured, named. But maps tell only part of the story. Beneath the lines and borders lay deeper transformations, cultural, the ecological, and human. The Columbian Exchange swept across the planet like a silent storm. Tomatoes and potatoes from the Americas changed European diets. Horses and wheat transformed the lives of indigenous peoples. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza devastated populations from Mexico to the Philippines, wiping out entire societies before muskets ever arrived. This was not just contact, it was collision. Languages crossed oceans. So did religions. Catholic cathedrals rose where temples once stood. Jesuits debated Confucian scholars. Traders haggled in mixed tongues. Across Latin America, Africa, and Asia, new cultures were born. Mestizo, Creole, syncretic, blending the old with the imposed, the native with the foreign. Even identity became fluid. A merchant in Goa, a priest in Manila, a governor in Lima, each lived in a world that had never existed before. Yet for all the wonder, the age of discovery also left scars. Empires grew fat on conquest. Slavery was institutionalized. Colonies were carved from indigenous lands and governed from distant palaces. The thirst for wealth and dominion spread with the wind. And while the explorers often sailed under banners of faith or science, they carried with them the machinery of power, weapons, flags, laws not made for those they would rule. Still, something remarkable had happened. For the first time in human history, the world had become a single interwoven system. Trade linked lives across hemispheres. Ideas traveled faster than ever before. The sense of isolation that once divided civilizations began to erode. The earth, vast though it remained, now felt reachable, round, connected, shared. And yet, even now, the legacy of that age lingers. Some nations were born from discovery. Others were broken by it. Some cultures were enriched, others erased. And the questions it raised about progress, conquest, curiosity, and cost still echo. What does it mean to discover a land already lived in? What is gained when a world is mapped? And what is lost? The explorers set out in search of wealth, of spices and shores. But what they found was more profound. The planet itself, in all its complexity. And so we end where we began, gazing out at the horizon, wondering what lies beyond. The age of discovery is over, but the journey, the search to understand this world and our place within it, continue. And there you have it, little dreamer, another tale, tucked in and told, like a blanket of stars across your mind. If you're still awake, well, bless your stamina. And if you somehow forgot to tap, like, or subscribe earlier, go ahead and do it now, before the dreams pull you under. I'll be right here, waiting in the next story. Until then, sleep well and sail gently.